East Prussia, August 17, 1943. Early morning. Steam hissed from the iron belly of the locomotive as it idled on the platform. The air was thick with coal smoke and the scent of wet pine carried on the wind. Standing alone near the edge of the tracks, General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland drew deeply on a cigarette, watching a thin trail of ash drift into the dawn mist. In his leather-gloved hands was a folded intelligence report, smudged, creased, and marked dringend, sofort vorlegen, urgent, present immediately. Inside were the first combat observations confirming what many in the Luftwaffe command had dismissed as fantasy: American twin-engine P-38 Lightnings, fighters once thought too limited in range to cross deep into Germany, had just escorted bombers more than 150 miles beyond the Rhine. He could still hear the reports from the pilots who had barely made it back from the chaos of the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids. Voices cracked by exhaustion and disbelief. Herr General, Sie waren überall. The Lightnings, they followed us even past Würzburg. 2 engines, drop tanks under the wings. Impossible range. Galland had no reason to doubt them. The raid of August 17, 1943, had been one of the largest and bloodiest daylight operations of the war. Over 376 American bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, had crossed into Germany in twin formations. One target, the ball-bearing plants of Schweinfurt. The other, Messerschmitt's main assembly works in Regensburg. The Luftwaffe had scrambled everything it could. The skies above Augsburg, Nuremberg, and Regensburg became killing fields. German pilots claimed over 60 bombers that day, but the price had been catastrophic. Dozens of Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters shot down. Irreplaceable veterans gone, and amid that aerial slaughter, German pilots had seen something new: P-38s flying beyond any range chart known to the Luftwaffe's intelligence section. Galland flicked the cigarette into the gravel, picked up his briefcase, and turned toward the station building. His train to Berlin would leave within the hour, but he had an unscheduled stop to make: Hall, the private estate of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe. Inside the train compartment, Galland reviewed the documents again. Allied fighter escort reports, fuel endurance calculations, photographs from downed P-38 wreckage showing jettisonable fuel tanks. The evidence was irrefutable. The Americans had solved the problem of escort range. For years, the Luftwaffe had counted on that one weakness. Every German strategist believed the same truth: the bombers would always have to come without protection once they reached deep Germany. It was the unspoken foundation of the Reich's air defense plan, the assumption that beyond Aachen or Antwerp, the bombers would be naked and alone. Now that illusion had shattered. Galland leaned back, exhaling slowly as the train lurched forward. He knew Göring's temperament: impulsive, prideful, and allergic to bad news. The Reichsmarschall didn't tolerate contradiction, especially from his subordinates, but this couldn't wait. When the train pulled into Göring's private siding near Hall later that day, Galland stepped out and was immediately met by a young adjutant in a pressed white tunic. "The Reichsmarschall will see you now," the aide said curtly. Inside the hunting lodge, Göring sat at the head of a long oak table, the walls behind him lined with trophies from Africa and the Alps: lions, boars, elk. His uniform gleamed under the chandelier, medals glinting against the deep blue fabric. He looked up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, Galland, the famous ace with the worried brow. Come, tell me, what catastrophe has our brave fighter arm discovered today?" Galland set the folder on the table and opened it. "Herr Reichsmarschall, new reconnaissance confirms that the Americans are using P-38 Lightnings equipped with auxiliary fuel tanks. They escorted bombers well past the main river today, as far as Regensburg." Göring's smile vanished. He leaned forward slightly. "That's impossible. Their range doesn't permit it." Galland held his ground. "I'm afraid it does now. Sir, these photographs were taken from one of the crash sites. The P-38s are fitted with drop tanks. They can fly from England, accompany the bombers into the heart of Germany, and still return." A long silence followed. Göring's gaze hardened. "Drop tanks?" He laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "Rubbish. American propaganda. No fighter can fly that far, not even ours." Galland's jaw tightened. "With respect, Reichsmarschall, they already have. My pilots saw them with their own eyes." Göring waved a gloved hand. "Then your pilots were mistaken. You people see ghosts when the pressure mounts. Write a clarification to the fighter staff: long-range American escort fighters do not exist. I will not have panic spread through the ranks." Galland hesitated, stunned. "Sir, if we ignore this..." "Enough," Göring snapped, slamming his palm against the table. You think I will believe that the Americans have achieved what even our finest engineers could not? No, they will run out of fuel long before they reach the Ruhr. Mark my words. Galland's mouth tightened. He gathered the papers quietly. There was nothing more to say. The air between them hung heavy, pride clashing with reality. When he stepped outside again, the afternoon light had shifted. A pair of Luftwaffe guards saluted as he passed, their boots snapping in unison. Galland paused on the steps, looking out over the forest that surrounded Göring's estate. In his gut, he felt it, the sinking certainty that the Luftwaffe had just sealed its fate. That single order, long-range fighters do not exist, would echo through every airfield command post and operations room across the Reich. And when the next wave of P-38s came, deeper than before, no one would be prepared. He lit another cigarette, staring at the smoke curling into the sky. If they deny the truth today, he muttered, they'll pay for it in blood tomorrow. Western Germany, October 1943. The smell of burnt aviation fuel still hung over the airfield at Wernicken, drifting across the crumpled wreck of a Bf-109 that had barely landed at dawn. In the dispersal bunker, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and frustration. Mechanics wiped soot from their faces while pilots, still in flight gear, argued in low, bitter voices. A lone Schwarmführer, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Meyer, slammed his fist onto a wooden table, rattling empty coffee cups. I'm telling you, they chased us past Leipzig. Those damned twins can follow us anywhere now. Across the room, an operations officer shook his head as he scribbled on a map. Orders say American fighters can't reach this far inland. Meyer stepped forward, eyes sharp from adrenaline and disbelief. Orders be damned, they were there, long-range P-38s. Drop tanks, I saw them with my own eyes. The room fell silent. Everyone had heard the rumors, but no one dared repeat them too loudly. Göring's decree had spread like scripture. American escort fighters do not exist. Anyone contradicting it risked being labeled hysterical or defeatist. The door burst open. A runner entered, cheeks flushed from cold and panic. Herr Major, another bomber wave sighted, and escorts. Deep in the west. Heads snapped toward him. He held a crumpled message slip. The operations officer snatched it. Scanning the text, his expression drained of color. Galland's warning had come true, faster than anyone expected. Schweinfurt, same day, noon. The roar of B-17 engines filled the sky like an oncoming storm. Anti-aircraft batteries hammered upward in black blossoms of flak. But the bombers held their line, steadfast and relentless. Then came the escorts. A formation of P-38 lightnings sliced through the clouds, their twin booms gleaming under the pale sun. They dove with terrifying precision, their .50 caliber guns tearing into a staffel of Bf-110s trying to climb into firing position. Oberfeldwebel Rudolf Hank heard the scream of engines behind him. Scheiße! A burst rocked his canopy. A P-38 flashed past, its wingtip markings unmistakable. He pulled hard, but the twin-engine American fighter stayed glued to his tail. That shouldn't have been possible. Every training document said the P-38 couldn't fly this deep. Couldn't fight this long, couldn't possibly be here. But it was. Hank bailed out moments later, parachute opening as he drifted over farmland littered with the smoke trails of falling aircraft. As he descended, he watched the battle unfold with growing horror, German fighters diving and failing to break away. Outnumbered and outranged by an enemy they had been told did not exist. The delusion was over. Reality had arrived, in aluminium, gasoline, and gunfire. Berlin, Luftwaffe High Command. Next morning, Galland stood before a wall-sized operations map dotted with black pins, each marking a Luftwaffe aircraft lost the previous day. The cluster over Schweinfurt looked like a wound bleeding iron. Generaloberst Gunther Korten entered quietly, glancing at the map before fixing his gaze on Galland. I've spoken with Göring, he said. He believes the reports are exaggerated. He insists the P-38s turned back early. Galland exhaled sharply. He believes what makes him comfortable. Korten lowered his voice. He has ordered us to stop referring to American long-range capabilities in briefings. He says it undermines morale. Galland stared at him, stunned. Morale? The men are dying. Veterans. Squadron leaders. We can't replace them fast enough. If we don't adapt, if we don't face this, we're finished. Korten looked away. You know the Reichsmarschall. He will not be contradicted. Galland stepped closer. If Göring refuses to accept reality, then reality will destroy us. Korten said nothing. The silence spoke for him. Northern France, November 1943. Another raid, another disaster. The Americans came with even more escorts, P-38s ranging farther than before. their endurance increasing with each new tank fitted under their wings. Reports filtered back from pilots who limped home. They followed us past Metz. They chased us all the way to the Saar. They're everywhere now. Command wrote the same reply every time: impossible. Galland gathered pilot testimonies, combat film, and crash site photographs, meticulously catalogued evidence that could no longer be denied. He placed the stack of documents on Göring's desk in December 1943. Göring didn't even open the folder. "Your pilots are cowards," he said flatly. "They see American fighters where there are none." Galland's face hardened. He stood at attention, but his voice carried the weight of buried fury. "Herr Reichsmarschall, the pilots are dying because we are fighting ghosts of our own imagination." Göring rose, towering and furious. "Enough! I command the Luftwaffe, and I say the Americans cannot escort bombers to central Germany. It is physically impossible." Galland saluted, turned, and left without another word. Behind closed doors, Göring muttered to his adjutants, "If the Americans ever send fighters to Berlin, may the devil take me." He would live to see it, sooner than he ever imagined. Berlin, January 11, 1944, 9:20 hours. Frost clung to the shattered windows of Luftwaffe Reichs Operations Center as the morning briefing began. A heavy silence hung over the room, the kind that settles when men know a storm is coming but refuse to acknowledge the clouds. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland stood beside the massive operations map, hands clasped behind his back. Across the table, senior officers murmured over reports of American bomber concentrations gathering in England. The name of the operation was unknown to the Germans, but history would remember it as the prelude to something catastrophic. Big week. In the corridor outside, a runner sprinted past the open doorway. Moments later, he burst into the room, out of breath. Massive bomber formations approaching Bremen and Oschersleben. Escorts, multiple types, too many to count. Galland leaned forward. "Escorts already? At this distance?" The runner nodded, eyes wide. "Sir, they're not turning back. They're pushing deeper." Galland felt a chill despite the heated room. If escorts were staying with the bombers this early, it meant something worse than P-38s had arrived. Something newer. Something faster. Something with impossible endurance. And then came the first radio call of the day, frantic. Panicked. Unmistakable. "Mustangs. Mustangs everywhere. God help us, they're diving from above." The room fell silent. The P-51 had arrived on the Eastern Front the previous year in small numbers. But the Germans had never encountered them this deep or in such overwhelming force. Göring's denial had met reality. Over Oschersleben, minutes later, Lieutenant Franz Stigler, veteran ace, pulled his Bf-109G into a climbing turn. He'd fought P-47s. He'd fought P-38s, but this was different. The aircraft on his tail was fast. Terrifyingly so, its silhouette unmistakable, sleek fuselage, bubble canopy, broad laminar flow wings. A P-51B Mustang. The Mustang stayed glued to him even as he dove through cloud. Stigler banked right, the Mustang banked with him. He pulled up, the Mustang followed effortlessly. "They have no fuel for this," Stigler shouted into his radio. "They shouldn't be here." His wingman screamed as traces stitched across his cockpit. A plume of black smoke spiraled downward. Stigler's engine rattled under the strain. He punched through a cloud layer, desperately searching for an escape. But the Mustang pilot held the advantage. One burst. A flash of light. And half of Stigler's stabilizer sheared off. He dove for the deck. Engine coughing, canopy fogging from the cold. Above, dozens of P-51s tore through German formations with terrifying speed and precision. The Luftwaffe pilots were overwhelmed before the battle had even begun. The escorts were no longer turning back. They were staying the whole way. Berlin, that afternoon. Galland stormed into Göring's office without being announced. Snow dripped from his greatcoat onto the ornate rug. Göring looked up from a plate of pastries. "Galland, you look like death. Speak." Galland tossed a stack of new combat reports onto the desk. "They're here, Herr Reichsmarschall. P-51 Mustangs, long range. Deadly fast, maneuverable as the devil. They escorted the bombers all the way in and all the way out. Our fighters were slaughtered." Göring frowned, unconvinced. "Impossible. The Mustang is nothing but a modified British design. It cannot fly from England to Oschersleben." Galland slammed his palm down. "They did. Our pilots fought them at low altitude over the target, and again over Munster on the return flight. They stayed with the bombers the entire mission." Göring stiffened, but his voice came out cold and dismissive. "Then your pilots panicked again." Galland stared at him, truly stared, and finally saw what many had already suspected: the Reichsmarshal would never face the truth. "Sir, if we do not adjust our tactics, our training, and our fuel allocation, we will lose everything. The Jagdwaffe is being bled dry." Göring's face hardened. "You underestimate German willpower, and you overestimate the Americans. They rely on machines, we rely on spirit." Galland stepped back slowly. "And machines, Herr Reichsmarschall, don't run out of spirit." He turned and left without waiting for a dismissal. Behind him, Göring shouted, "If the Mustangs ever escort bombers to Berlin, you may shoot me yourself." He would swallow those words in less than a month. February 1944, big week. 6 days. 262 Luftwaffe fighters lost. Hundreds more damaged. Dozens of irreplaceable aces dead or wounded. By the last day, some Gruppen took off with pilots so inexperienced they could barely hold formation. Others never returned at all. Fuel was rationed so tightly that flight training fell to less than an hour per pilot. New recruits went to combat barely knowing how to land. Across airfields from France to East Prussia, the same scene repeated. Empty hangars. Silent runways. Black wreaths on squadron doors. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was dying in front of its own commanders. And at its heart stood the unspoken truth Galland had fought to prevent. Denial had killed them. Not the P-38. Not the P-51. Not the bombers. But the refusal to accept that the world was changing. On a snowy March morning, as he walked across the icy courtyard of the Air Ministry, Galland whispered to himself, "We're fighting yesterday's war, with yesterday's ideas, and running out of tomorrow's." Germany, March 1944. The wind howled across the ruins of Dielen Air Base as ground crews pushed a half-frozen Bf-109 toward a hardened shelter. Its tires left shallow tracks in the snow. The plane had been flown by a pilot with fewer than 9 flight hours. His first combat sortie had ended with a dead engine. A forced landing, and hands still shaking from fear. Inside the operations hut, a kerosene lantern flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the walls. Major Werner Andres, Gruppenkommandeur of 3, JG1, stared at the roster pinned to the corkboard. Next to half the names, someone had drawn small black crosses. They had been added in a single week. Big Week had broken them. But the killing didn't stop. A young Unteroffizier entered the hut, snow falling from his shoulders. "Herr Major, the fuel depot is empty again. We cannot run afternoon training." Andres didn't look up. How much did headquarters allocate? The Unteroffizier swallowed. 30 liters per aircraft. 30 liters, barely enough for engine warm-up, let alone flight. Andres closed his eyes, dismissed. Outside, the snowstorm intensified, but for the Luftwaffe it was not snow that buried them, it was the weight of a war they could no longer fight. Berlin, Luftwaffe High Command briefing. April 1944. Maps covered the table, spread between ashtrays and half-drunk cups of bitter coffee. The room smelled of sweat, cigarette smoke, and hopelessness. Galland entered and took his place before the senior officers of the Reich's air defense. The men looked exhausted, uniforms wrinkled, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. Generaloberst Gunther Korten cleared his throat. Losses from last quarter, nearly 2,000 fighters destroyed. Replacement pilots, 425. He paused. Operationally capable pilots, fewer than 180. No one spoke. Galland rose, flipping open a binder of combat reports from JG-26, JG-27, JG-3, and JG-1. He read aloud. Many recruits unable to maintain formation. Fatalities during takeoff increasing. Fuel restrictions prevent gunnery training. Veterans lost, no one to train replacements. He placed the binder silently on the table. "Gentlemen, we have entered a death spiral." A murmur rippled across the room. Galland continued. "The Americans now escort from coast to target and back. P-51s at every altitude. P-47s diving from above the clouds. P-38s sweeping ahead of each bomber stream. We are no longer intercepting. We are being hunted." Göring was not present. He rarely attended these briefings now, but his shadow loomed over every decision. His orders remained unchanged. No mention of American long-range fighters in official reports. No acknowledgement of Luftwaffe collapse. It was madness, and it was becoming policy. Galland looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every man present. "We must change tactics, abandon failed formations, preserve fuel for training, redeploy our best Gruppen for concentrated attacks. Or we will have no fighter arm left by summer." No one objected, no one dared. But no one believed Göring would approve it, either. Southeastern Germany, May 12, 1944. A clear morning, blue skies. Perfect conditions for a slaughter. The 8th Air Force came in waves. 886 bombers, 980 escort fighters. A steel river stretching from horizon to horizon. On the ground at Pilsen Air Base, Oberleutnant Meyer, the same man who had first spotted long-range P-38s months ago, strapped into a worn Bf-109 G6. His crew chief, face smeared with oil, clapped him on the shoulder. "Come back alive, sir." Meyer smiled weakly. "I'll try." He took off with the rest of his staffel, climbing hard through cloud. But the Americans were waiting. A wall of P-51 Mustangs sliced into them just as they reached altitude. Tracers filled the sky, explosions hammered the air. Meyer rolled hard right, pulling into a dive, but a Mustang dropped in behind him with ease. He checked his mirror, the enemy pilot held steady, patient, like a hawk waiting for the kill. Then the guns lit up. A burst ripped through Meyer's wing. The 109 snapped into a spin. Flames licked the canopy. Meyer bailed out, the parachute jerking him upward violently. As he drifted through the sky, he saw the truth laid bare beneath him. The Luftwaffe wasn't fighting the Americans anymore. It was being erased by them. Wrecks littered the landscape, airfields burned, and above it all, the contrails of P-51s crisscrossed the sky in absolute control. He landed hard in a wheat field, uninjured but broken. "This can't go on," he whispered. "We can't win like this." But the truth was simpler. They weren't winning at all. They were surviving, barely. Berlin, Galland's office, June 1944. Galland stared at the latest operational readiness report. The numbers were worse than ever. He picked up the phone. "Connect me with the Reichsmarschall." There was a long pause. The operator hesitated before complying. At last, Göring's voice crackled through the line. "What now, Galland? Another excuse for our failures?" Galland kept his voice steady. "No excuses, sir, only facts. If we do not overhaul the training pipeline, shift fuel from bomber units, and restructure the fighter command, we will have no effective air force within weeks." Göring scoffed. "The Americans rely on machines. We rely on German fighting spirit." Galland closed his eyes, jaw clenched. "Sir, spirit is not a tactic." Silence. Then Göring's voice returned, cold, dismissive, final. "If the Luftwaffe fails, it is because you and your fighter generals lack imagination, not because of my orders." The line went dead. Galland set the phone down slowly. In that moment, he realized the truth. The Luftwaffe would not die in battle. It would die in the conference rooms of Berlin. And nothing, not skill, not courage, not sacrifice, could save it now. Western France, June 6, 1944, 5:20 a.m. The horizon glowed with pale orange as the first rays of dawn broke over the French coast. Somewhere inland, the hum of engines echoed faintly, not German engines, but the steady drone of thousands of Allied aircraft sweeping overhead. Hundreds of B-26 Marauders. Hundreds more P-47s and P-51s. C-47s towing gliders. Spitfires patrolling low over the hedgerows. The Luftwaffe was nowhere. At Evreux airfield, Jagdgeschwader 2, Richthofen, scrambled what little it had left. Mechanics pushed two functional FW-190s toward the runway, the rest were grounded with no fuel. No engines, or no pilots. Hauptmann Karl-Heinz Weber climbed into his fighter, strapping himself in with trembling hands. He had flown over 300 missions, but he had never seen anything like the Armada now crossing the Normandy coast. His radio crackled with an order that felt more like a plea. "All available aircraft, intercept the invasion force at once." He taxied out, heart pounding. The sky ahead was black with silhouettes, parachutes, gliders, bombers, fighters, a moving wall of Allied air power. As he lifted off, flak bursts exploded across the sky, but none of it belonged to the Luftwaffe. Weber pushed his throttle forward. But before he reached 800 meters, a pair of P-51 Mustangs dove out of the sun. He didn't even have time to shout. A burst of .50 caliber fire shredded his wing. The FW-190 rolled violently. Weber yanked the stick back, fighting for control, but the aircraft slammed into a field seconds later, bursting into flame. He never knew what hit him. That morning, the Luftwaffe managed only 2 attack sorties against the invasion beaches, 2 lonely aircraft in a sky owned entirely by the Allies. The story of June 6 wasn't that the Luftwaffe fought and failed. The truth was far worse. It wasn't there at all. Berlin, Luftwaffe High Command. June 7, 1944. Thunder rumbled outside as another storm rolled over the capital. Inside, Galland stood before a room of exhausted officers. Their faces were pale, their uniforms damp from rain and sweat. On the wall, a giant operational map showed the Normandy coastline, thick with Allied arrows pushing inland. General Oberst Korten spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. We committed every available aircraft to Normandy. The result, 2 sorties. Both lost. Nobody reacted. There was no shock left to feel. Galland stepped toward the map, pointing to German fighter bases across western France. Our Gruppen have fewer than 20 operational fighters in total. Most aircraft are destroyed on the ground. Fuel deliveries have stopped entirely in some sectors. Pilots cannot even train to fly straight. He faced the room. Gentlemen, we no longer possess an air force capable of defending the Reich. A murmur of disbelief rose, not because they doubted him, but because they finally realized he was right. One officer whispered, "How did it happen so quickly?" Galland answered without hesitation. "It didn't happen quickly, it happened when we ignored reality." East Prussia, July 1944. The forests were thick with summer heat when Galland arrived at a forward airfield to inspect the remains of JG-54. He had known many of these men for years. Now only a handful greeted him, the rest were dead, wounded, or scattered across makeshift hospitals. 3 Bf-109s Saturday on the tarmac. All were damaged, none had fuel. Hauptmann Dietrich Hannes, gaunt from exhaustion, approached Galland with a brittle smile. "Herr General, welcome to what used to be a fighter wing." Galland forced a nod. "How many sorties this week?" Hannes laughed dryly. "Sorties? We don't even have enough fuel to test the engines. The Russians bomb us by day. The Americans by night. We hide in the forest like hunted animals." Galland looked at the cracked canopy of a nearby 109, bullet holes patched with aluminium scraps. The once feared Jagdwaffe now resembled a graveyard disguised as an airfield. "What do you need?" Galland asked softly. Hannes stared at him, eyes hollow. "Time, fuel, pilots, leadership." He paused. "And maybe a miracle." Berlin, Göring's private residence. August 1944. Göring sat slumped in his ornate chair, the gold trim and velvet cushions looking strangely out of place in a city hammered by bombs. He stared at Galland with glassy eyes. "The FW-190D will fix everything," he muttered, "or the Me-262. Yes, the jet will save us. The Führer only needs convincing." Galland swallowed his frustration. "Sir, the Me-262 is a fighter, not a bomber. Let it fight, let it defend the Reich. It is the only aircraft we have that can match the Americans and British." But Göring waved him off, smiling faintly. "Hitler wants it as a blitzbomber. And what the Führer wants." Galland felt his throat tighten. This was the end. They had the fastest fighter in the world, and they were going to use it to drop bombs instead of saving their pilots. Denial had become doctrine. Doctrine had become death. Germany, autumn 1944. The skies over the Reich turned permanently silver, not from weather, but from the endless streams of Allied bombers and Mustangs overhead. Cities burned daily, fuel convoys were destroyed before they reached airfields, fighter pilots were killed in training accidents caused by lack of practice. By October, Luftwaffe fighter strength was less than 20% of what it had been a year earlier. The Jagdwaffe was no longer a fighting force. It was a memory. In late November, standing on a freezing tarmac littered with burned aircraft, Galland whispered to no one, "This is what happens when truth is forbidden." Western Germany, January 1st Street, 1945, 8:50 a.m. The morning fog over Eindhoven, Asch, Metz, and dozens of other Allied airfields hung like a grey curtain as German fighters swept in low over the treetops. It was Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's last great gamble, an all-out strike intended to cripple Allied air power on the Western Front. For one fleeting moment, it looked like the old ferocity had returned. More than 900 German fighters, Bf-109s, FW-190s, even some antiquated variants, thundered across the border at treetop height. Engines screaming, pilots tightening their harnesses as they saw Allied airfields emerge through the mist. But what had once been the most feared fighter force in the world was now a skeleton crew of half-trained youngsters led by a handful of exhausted veterans. Their charts were outdated, their navigation flawed, their fuel critically limited. Gefreiter Hans Lohen, a 19-year-old pilot with just 17 flight hours, clutched the stick of his 109, hands shaking. "Stay low, Hans, follow my lead," shouted Oberleutnant Bohm over the radio. But the fog swallowed them. Units became scattered, some groups veered off course by more than 20 miles. Others ran out of fuel before even reaching the target. Those who reached the airfields attacked with desperate rage. Some set parked Mustangs and Thunderbolts ablaze. Others strafed hangars and fuel trucks. For a few minutes, it looked like success. Then the Allied response came. P-47 Thunderbolts launched in swarms, climbing vertically with raw power. Mustangs pounced from above. Double-A guns roared to life. The sky turned into a slaughterhouse. Lowen saw a Thunderbolt flash past, then his canopy exploded in a burst of .50 caliber fire. His engine died instantly. Flames licked the cockpit. He bailed out, landing in an icy field just as his aircraft smashed into the ground. Across the Western Front, Bodenplatte achieved tactical damage, but at a cost from which the Luftwaffe would never recover. 277 fighters lost. 213 pilots killed. 81 captured or missing. The majority were the last trained pilots the Luftwaffe still had. Galland called it the death blow to the Jagdwaffe. Berlin, a week later. A cold wind whipped through the shattered windows of the Luftwaffe command bunker. Galland stood at the head of a long table, its surface cluttered with casualty reports, flight rosters, and fuel ration decrees that read like death sentences. General Oberst Korten was dead, killed in the assassination attempt against Hitler months earlier. His replacement, General Oberst Hans Jeschonek, had shot himself the year before under pressure he could no longer bear. Now General Karl Koller struggled to maintain coherence in a collapsing organization. Koller's voice cracked as he read the latest standings. Operational fighters across the entire Reich, 186. The number hung in the air like a ghost. Galland clenched his jaw. "We have Gruppen on paper only. In reality, they're flying with 3 or 4 serviceable aircraft." Koller nodded grimly. "Most pilots cannot complete formation flying. Some cannot even land without assistance." Göring entered the bunker at that moment, wearing a fur-lined coat, jewels glittering on his chest despite the cold. His face was bloated, his eyes glassy. He looked around the room and forced a smile. "Gentlemen, I expect your full report on the enemy bomber threat, but I trust we are holding firm?" Galland stepped forward. "Not this time, not anymore. Herr Reichsmarschall, there is no bomber threat. There is only Allied air supremacy. Total, absolute." Göring's face stiffened. "Nonsense. We will rally. The Me-262 will turn the tide." Galland met his gaze. "The tide already drowned us. And the Me-262 could have saved the Reich, 2 years ago, before you made it a bomber." Göring's face flushed purple. "How dare you?" Galland didn't yield. "You denied reality. You denied fuel. You denied the P-38s. You denied the Mustangs. And now you deny that the Luftwaffe is dead." The room froze. Göring raised a trembling hand. "General Galland, you are relieved of your command." Galland bowed his head once, not in submission, but in mourning. The Luftwaffe had just fired the only man who still spoke the truth. Southern Germany, February 1945. Snow blanketed the countryside as the roar of Allied bombers echoed across the valleys. Villagers stared upward at endless streams of silver aircraft, some heading toward Munich, others toward Nuremberg, all escorted by P-51s at every altitude. A classroom of new Luftwaffe recruits huddled around a battered Bf-109 in a frozen barn. Their instructor, a worn-out Feldwebel with frostbitten fingers, shouted, "Listen closely, you have 30 minutes of fuel for training. Take off, circle once, and land. Do not attempt combat maneuvers." One boy raised his hand. "But Herr Feldwebel, how do we learn dogfighting?" The instructor stared at him, eyes hollow. "You won't, you will simply hope." When those boys first met Allied fighters in the air, they died within seconds. Berlin, April 1945. The city burned. The sky burned. The Reich burned. Allied Mustangs flew overhead unchallenged. Even as Soviet artillery shook the streets, the once mighty Luftwaffe was reduced to scattered jets, a few night fighters, and desperate volunteers in hopeless missions. Galland, now assigned to lead a small Me-262 unit, watched his handful of jets take off one last time. Their engines screamed as they raced down the runway, leaving trails of smoke behind them. They were fast, faster than anything in the world, but too few. Too late, too strangled by the collapse of everything around them. He whispered, "They could have saved us, if only we had listened." The Führerbunker, late April 1945. Galland was summoned to Hitler. He entered a dim conference room where the Führer, trembling from illness, stared at a map covered in red arrows. Galland, Hitler rasped, why have my fighters failed me? Galland's reply was quiet, but firm. My Führer, because they were never allowed to be what they needed to be. Hitler stared at him in silence, then dismissed him with a shaking hand. It was the last time they ever spoke. By May, the Luftwaffe no longer existed except on paper. The Reich surrendered. The skies fell silent. And Germany, once the birthplace of the jet age, once the apex of aerial innovation, had been brought to ruin by its own blindness. A blindness that began on a railway platform in August 1943. When a single warning was delivered. And ignored. Flensburg, Germany, May 8, 1945, 2 a.m. Rain pattered softly against the broken windows of the temporary German government headquarters as the last hours of the Third Reich drained away. In a dimly lit office, Adolf Galland stood alone, staring at a stack of final operational reports, the epitaph of the Luftwaffe. Fuel reserves, 0. Operational fighters, fewer than 30 across the entire Reich. Trainable pilots, none. Functioning airfields, all lost or captured. He closed the binder with a quiet thud. It felt like burying a friend. Outside, thunder rumbled, but Galland knew it wasn't weather. It was Allied aircraft returning from their final patrols, their engines echoing through the night like a funeral march. London, same morning. In a war room beneath Whitehall, RAF planners marked the clock. 001, ceasefire. The air war over Europe was officially over. A pilot from the 8th Air Force looked up from his mug of coffee and muttered. Hard to believe, no more Mustangs. No more fortresses, nothing left to chase. A British intelligence officer leaned over the table, tapping the map of Germany with a pencil. The Luftwaffe didn't fall, it collapsed. We didn't defeat their fighters, we outlived them. He wasn't wrong. Western Germany, afternoon. An American reconnaissance team toured what remained of JG-26's main airfield. They moved slowly, carefully, stepping around burned wrecks of Bf-109s and FW-190s scattered like crushed tin across the tarmac. A young lieutenant stopped beside a melted aluminium fuselage, still faintly warm from the last bombing raid. These were the guys we feared? The ones from 40? An older sergeant shook his head. They were lions, until they ran out of food, fuel, and time. He crouched, picking up a scorched pilot's badge from the ash. Command killed 'em long before we did. Flensburg, evening. Galland walked alone toward the waterfront, hands in his coat pockets as cold waves crashed against the grey stones. The war was finished, his command was gone, his pilots, the men he'd tried so desperately to protect, lay scattered across Europe in unmarked graves. He replayed the warning he delivered in August 1943. On that railway platform in East Prussia, he remembered Göring's laughter, the dismissive wave of a jeweled hand. Long-range fighters do not exist. Impossible. Impossible. Galland watched an American P-51 circle overhead at low altitude, not as a threat, but as a patrol. It was almost peaceful. He imagined confronting Göring again. Years too late. There, look up, the impossible. Berlin, weeks later. Interrogation rooms in the shattered capital filled with captured German officers. During one session, a British officer asked a former Luftwaffe colonel, "When did you lose the war in the air?" The colonel didn't hesitate. The day Göring told us the Americans had no long-range fighters. Washington, D.C., summer 1945. In a Pentagon office, a staff analyst read the first translated Luftwaffe records captured after the surrender. He paused at Galland's detailed reports, the ones ignored by Berlin. Fuel shortages. Pilot attrition. Long-range escort sightings. Training failures. Leadership denial. He closed the file with a deep sigh. If Göring had listened to this man, we'd have paid a lot more blood for victory. Munich, Germany, autumn 1945. Galland testified before Allied officers compiling the official history of the air war. He spoke plainly, without bitterness, without deflection. He described the numbers, the tactics, the failures, but most importantly, he described the single moment when saving the Luftwaffe had still been possible. The warning he gave, the truth that was denied. A British officer finally asked, "General Galland, what destroyed the Luftwaffe?" Galland leaned back, eyes tired, voice steady. Arrogance. Denial. And the belief that loyalty meant silence. He paused, folding his hands. We had the talent. We had the machines. We had the courage. What we didn't have was the freedom to tell the truth. The room stayed silent long after he finished. Final scene, December 1945. Snow drifted gently across a quiet German airfield reclaimed by weeds. Burned hangars stood like gravestones against the winter sky. An American P-51, now part of the occupation force, thundered overhead, its engine echoing through the empty valley. Galland stood by the edge of the runway, watching it fly. His breath formed thin clouds in the frosty air. He whispered the words he had carried for 2 years. "I warned them. And the price was everything." The Mustang banked into the horizon, leaving a thin contrail that glowed in the evening sun, the symbol of a truth that had reshaped the world. Denial had destroyed an air force. Reality had ruled the sky. And it all began on a railway platform in August 1943.